In the blood-soaked annals of Chinese history, few figures inspire as much fascination and horror as Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever claim the title of emperor in China's 5,000-year history. Her story is not one of gentle feminine virtue or quiet influence from behind palace screens, but rather a tale of calculated brutality, strategic manipulation, and an insatiable hunger for absolute power that would make Machiavelli himself recoil in admiration and terror. Born around 624 in the province of Shaanxi, Wu Zhao entered a world where women were expected to remain invisible, their voices unheard beyond the confines of domestic quarters. The Tang dynasty, though relatively progressive in some respects, still operated under the rigid Confucian hierarchy that placed women firmly beneath men in all matters of governance and authority. Yet from her earliest years, Wu displayed an intelligence and ambition that would prove impossible to contain within traditional boundaries. Her father, Wu Shihuo, served as a general and later as a duke, providing young Wu with an education typically reserved for sons. She learned to read and write with exceptional skill, studied classical literature, and developed the sharp analytical mind that would later serve her so devastatingly in the treacherous world of imperial politics. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to observe, to listen, and to understand the intricate web of relationships, favors, and fears that govern the lives of the powerful. At the age of 13, Wu Zhao's life changed forever when she was selected to serve as a concubine to Emperor Taizong, one of China's most revered rulers. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, populated by hundreds of women competing for the emperor's attention, each hoping that a moment's favor might elevate their status or secure their family's fortune. For most, it was a gilded cage where beauty and compliance were the only currencies of value. But Wu Zhao was different. While other concubines focused on perfecting their appearance and mastering the arts of entertainment, she devoted herself to understanding the mechanics of power itself. She observed how decisions were made, who held real influence, and most crucially, how information flowed through the palace corridors like blood through veins. She cultivated relationships not just with other concubines, but with eunuchs, servants, and minor officials who formed the invisible infrastructure of imperial administration. During her time with Emperor Taizong, Wu remained largely unnoticed, holding the relatively low rank of talent, the fifth level in the concubine hierarchy. The emperor, focused on military campaigns and governance, showed little interest in the sharp-minded young woman from Shaanxi, but Wu was patient, watching, learning, and most importantly, making connections that would prove invaluable in the years to come. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, Wu faced the fate that awaited all imperial concubines who had not borne sons to the deceased emperor. According to tradition, she would be sent to a Buddhist temple to live out her days as a nun, effectively erased from the world of imperial politics forever. For most women, this would have meant the end of any dreams of power or influence. For Wu Zhao, it was merely an intermission in a carefully orchestrated campaign for supremacy. The Ganye Temple, where Wu was confined, became her unexpected sanctuary and training ground. While ostensibly devoted to Buddhist meditation and prayer, Wu used her time to cultivate a network of contacts and to develop the skills that would serve her return to power. She maintained correspondence with allies in the palace, gathered intelligence about political developments, and most crucially, she waited for her opportunity. That opportunity came in the form of Li Ji, who had become Emperor Gaozong upon his father's death. During Taizong's lifetime, the young prince had encountered Wu in the palace and had been struck by her intelligence and beauty. Now, as emperor, he found himself increasingly dissatisfied with his current empress Wang, who had failed to produce a male heir and whose family's political influence had become a source of frustration. Wu's return to the palace was orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Through intermediaries, she managed to arrange a private meeting with Emperor Gaozong during one of his visits to the temple. The encounter was carefully staged to appear accidental, though Wu had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a general planning a decisive battle. When they met, Wu presented herself not as a desperate former concubine seeking rescue, but as a sophisticated woman who had used her time in exile to develop both spiritual wisdom and political acumen. She spoke knowledgeably about current affairs, offered insights into palace dynamics that the emperor found valuable, and most importantly, she made it clear that her loyalty would be absolute and her discretion complete. Emperor Gaozong was captivated. Here was a woman who could match his intellectual interests while also providing the emotional and physical companionship he craved. Within months, Wu had been recalled to the palace, this time with the title of Zhao Yi, the second highest rank among imperial concubines. But Wu's ambitions extended far beyond securing a comfortable position in the harem. She had her sights set on the ultimate prize, the position of Empress, and she was prepared to eliminate anyone who stood in her way. Empress Wang, sensing the threat that Wu represented, initially made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating her rival. The Empress believed that by supporting Wu's return to the palace, she could use the concubine as an ally against Consort Xiao, another rival for the Emperor's affections. This decision would prove to be one of the most fatal miscalculations in Chinese imperial history. Wu moved against her rivals with the calculated precision of a master chess player, eliminating threats systematically while maintaining an appearance of innocence and loyalty. Her first target was Consort Xiao, whom she neutralized through a combination of slander, manipulation, and strategic positioning. Wu spread carefully crafted rumors about Xiao's family background and political loyalties, while simultaneously presenting herself as the emperor's most trusted advisor on matters both personal and political. But it was Wu's treatment of Empress Wang that would establish her reputation for ruthless cunning and reveal the depths to which she was willing to sink in pursuit of power. The Empress, desperate to maintain her position, had begun to view Wu as a potential ally rather than a threat, even going so far as to encourage the emperor's relationship with the concubine in hopes of weakening Consort Xiao's influence. Wu's masterstroke came in 654 with an act so shocking and calculated that it would be whispered about in palace corridors for centuries to come. She had given birth to a daughter, her first child with Emperor Gaozong, and the infant represented both an opportunity and a potential obstacle to her ultimate ambitions. In a move that demonstrated the absolute absence of maternal sentiment in favor of political calculation, Wu allegedly murdered her own infant daughter and arranged for the crime to be discovered in such a way that suspicion would fall upon Empress Wang. The plan was executed with diabolical precision. Wu waited until Empress Wang had visited her chambers, as was customary for the Empress to pay respects to imperial concubines who had recently given birth. After the Empress departed, Wu strangled the infant and then raised an alarm, claiming to have discovered the child's body upon her return to the room. The implication was clear and devastating. Empress Wang, driven by jealousy and desperation, had murdered an innocent child to eliminate a potential rival. Emperor Gaozong was horrified by the apparent crime, but Wu's performance of grief and shock was so convincing that he never questioned the narrative she had constructed. The emperor's love for Wu, combined with his genuine revulsion at what appeared to be an act of infanticide, sealed Empress Wang's fate. Within months, both Empress Wang and Consort Xiao had been stripped of their titles, imprisoned, and ultimately executed in a manner that reflected Wu's emerging taste for creative cruelty. The traditional account describes how Wu ordered that both women have their hands and feet amputated before being thrown into wine vats to die slowly and agonizingly. When Empress Wang cursed Wu with her dying breath, promising that she would return as a cat to haunt her murderer for eternity, Wu reportedly banned all cats from the palace for the remainder of her life. Whether this specific detail is historically accurate or legendary embellishment, it captures the essential truth about Wu's character. She was a woman who would stop at nothing to achieve and maintain power, and who possessed the psychological fortitude to live with the consequences of even the most horrific actions. With her primary rivals eliminated, Wu was elevated to the position of Empress in 655, but this was still far from satisfying her ultimate ambitions. She had achieved what no other concubine in Chinese history had managed, rising from the lowest ranks of the imperial harem to become the emperor's principal wife. Yet Wu understood that the title of Empress, while prestigious, still left her fundamentally dependent on her husband's continued favor and protection. As Empress Wu, she began the systematic process of consolidating power that would eventually lead to her unprecedented claim to imperial authority. She cultivated relationships with key officials, placed her supporters in crucial positions, and most importantly, she made herself indispensable to Emperor Gaozong's administration of the empire. Her intelligence and political acumen proved invaluable in managing the complex challenges facing the Tang dynasty, from military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms to internal rebellions and natural disasters. Wu's influence grew steadily as Emperor Gaozong's health began to decline. The emperor suffered from what modern historians believe may have been hypertension or stroke-related ailments, conditions that left him increasingly dependent on his empress for both personal care and governmental decision-making. Wu seized this opportunity to expand her role from advisor to de facto co-ruler, gradually assuming control over key aspects of imperial administration. Her methods during this period revealed the sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that would characterize her entire career. Rather than making dramatic pronouncements or obvious power grabs that might alarm potential opponents, Wu worked incrementally, consolidating her control over the imperial bureaucracy through a combination of appointments, dismissals, and strategic alliances. She identified officials whose loyalty could be purchased or coerced, eliminated those who posed threats to her growing influence, and created a network of supporters who owed their positions and prosperity to her patronage. Wu's approach to governance during this transitional period demonstrated her remarkable ability to balance multiple competing interests while advancing her own agenda. She supported military campaigns that enhanced the empire's prestige and territorial control, implemented domestic policies that maintained stability and economic growth, and managed the complex relationships between the imperial court and regional governors with a skill that impressed even her critics. But perhaps most importantly, Wu began the process of eliminating potential rivals within the imperial family itself. She understood that as long as there were legitimate male heirs to the throne, her own position would remain vulnerable to challenge. Her solution to this problem would prove to be as ruthless and systematic as her earlier elimination of Empress Wang and consort Xiao. The systematic elimination of threats to Wu's power reached its most shocking phase with her treatment of her own sons. Li Hong, the crown prince, and her eldest son with Emperor Gaozong, represented the most immediate obstacle to her continued dominance. As he reached maturity, Li Hong began to demonstrate the independence of thought and action that Wu recognized as fundamentally incompatible with her own ambitions for absolute control. In 675, Crown Prince Li Hong died suddenly under circumstances that have fueled centuries of speculation and accusation. The official cause of death was listed as illness, but contemporary sources and later historians have suggested that Wu arranged for her son's poisoning when it became clear that he would not serve as a compliant puppet ruler. The prince had reportedly begun to question some of his mother's more extreme policies and had shown disturbing signs of developing his own political agenda. Wu's second son, Li Xian, who became crown prince following his brother's death, proved equally problematic from his mother's perspective. Li Xian was intelligent, capable, and increasingly critical of Wu's growing influence over imperial administration. He represented not just a future threat to Wu's power, but an immediate challenge to her authority as he began to gather supporters among court officials who were uncomfortable with the unprecedented extent of female influence in government. The elimination of Li Xian required more elaborate planning than his brother's death, as Wu needed to discredit him politically before removing him physically. She orchestrated a campaign of accusations against the crown prince, claiming that he was plotting rebellion against his father and planning to usurp the throne prematurely. Evidence was manufactured, witnesses were coerced or bribed, and a narrative was constructed that portrayed Li Xian as an ungrateful and treasonous son who posed a mortal threat to imperial stability. In 680, Li Xian was stripped of his title, exiled, and ultimately forced to commit suicide. The official records describe his death as voluntary, a final act of filial piety in which the disgraced prince chose to spare his family further shame by taking his own life. But the reality, as understood by contemporary observers and later historians, was that Wu had successfully eliminated another obstacle to her continued dominance of imperial politics. With her most capable sons removed from the succession, Wu was able to advance her third son, Li Jie, later known as Emperor Zhongzong, to the position of crown prince. Li Jie was younger, less experienced, and more malleable than his deceased brothers, making him an ideal candidate from Wu's perspective. She could expect him to serve as a compliant figurehead who would allow her to continue exercising real power even after Emperor Gaozong's eventual death. Throughout this period of consolidating power and eliminating rivals, Wu was simultaneously building the institutional framework that would support her eventual claim to imperial authority. She established an extensive intelligence network that rivaled and eventually surpassed the traditional governmental surveillance systems. Her agents, drawn from all levels of society, provided her with detailed information about potential threats, political developments, and opportunities for advancement. Wu's spy network was notable not just for its scope, but for its sophistication. She recruited informants from among palace servants, provincial officials, military officers, and even Buddhist monks and Taoist priests. These agents provided her with intelligence that allowed her to anticipate and counter opposition before it could organize effectively. More importantly, The knowledge that Wu's eyes and ears were everywhere created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that discouraged potential conspirators from acting against her interests. The Empress also began to cultivate her own military support, recognizing that ultimate power in imperial China required the backing of armed force. She identified and promoted military commanders whose loyalty was personal rather than institutional, creating a network of generals who owed their positions and wealth to her patronage rather than to traditional military hierarchies or imperial appointment systems. Wu's military appointments were characterized by the same strategic thinking that marked all her political maneuvers. She advanced capable commanders who could deliver victories that enhanced her reputation, while ensuring that none of them accumulated enough independent power to pose a threat to her authority. She balanced competing military factions against each other, preventing any single group from becoming dominant, and she maintained direct control over key strategic positions and resources. As Emperor Gaozong's health continued to deteriorate throughout the 670s, Wu's role in governance became increasingly overt. She attended court sessions, participated in policy discussions, and issued directives that carried the full weight of imperial authority. While this arrangement was initially justified as necessary support for an ailing emperor, Wu gradually transformed it into a permanent power-sharing arrangement that effectively made her co-ruler of the empire. The emperor's declining health also provided Wu with opportunities to demonstrate her administrative capabilities and political judgment to the broader imperial bureaucracy. She handled complex diplomatic negotiations, managed military campaigns, and oversaw domestic policies with a competence that impressed even those officials who were philosophically opposed to female participation in government. Her success in these endeavors helped to normalize her unprecedented role and reduced resistance to her growing influence. Wu's management of the imperial bureaucracy during this period revealed her sophisticated understanding of how power actually functioned within the Chinese governmental system. She recognized that formal titles and positions were less important than the ability to control information flow, resource allocation, and personnel decisions. By positioning herself at the center of these critical functions, she made herself indispensable to the continued operation of imperial administration. When Emperor Gaozong finally died in 683, Wu was positioned to execute the final phase of her campaign for absolute power. Her son Li Jie ascended to the throne as Emperor Zhongzong, but Wu had no intention of relinquishing the authority she had spent decades accumulating. The new emperor was young, inexperienced, and completely unprepared for the complex challenges of ruling the vast Tang Empire. Wu's treatment of her son during his brief reign demonstrated the complete absence of maternal sentiment in her political calculations. When Emperor Zhongzong showed signs of developing independent judgment or questioned his mother's continued dominance of governmental affairs, Wu moved against him with the same ruthless efficiency she had displayed against all previous obstacles to her ambitions. The pretext for removing Emperor Zhongzong came when he attempted to promote his wife's father to a high governmental position without consulting Wu. This relatively minor act of independence was transformed by Wu into evidence of the young emperor's unfitness for rule. She orchestrated a palace coup that resulted in Zhongzong's deposition and exile after a reign of only 55 days, one of the shortest in Chinese imperial history. Wu replaced the deposed emperor with his younger brother, Li Dan, who became Emperor Ruizong. But this appointment was clearly understood by all observers to be purely ceremonial. Emperor Ruizong held the title but exercised no real authority, serving instead as a figurehead who provided legal legitimacy for Wu's continued rule, while she prepared for her ultimate transformation from power behind the throne to occupant of the throne itself. During the period when Emperor Ruizong nominally ruled, Wu began to implement the ideological and symbolic changes that would support her unprecedented claim to imperial authority. She commissioned scholars to research historical precedents for female rule, promoted philosophical arguments that challenged traditional gender hierarchies, and gradually introduced ceremonial practices that elevated her status above that of a traditional empress dowager. Wu's intellectual approach to legitimizing female rule demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of how political authority was constructed and maintained in Chinese civilization. She recognized that raw power, while necessary, was insufficient to establish lasting legitimacy. She needed to create a philosophical and historical framework that would make her rule appear not just acceptable, but inevitable and beneficial for the empire. The scholarly research Wu commissioned produced a body of literature that reinterpreted Chinese history and philosophy to support the concept of female imperial authority. Ancient texts were re-examined to identify examples of powerful women who had exercised governmental authority. Mythological figures were reinterpreted to emphasize feminine wisdom and capability, and new philosophical arguments were developed that challenged the Confucian assumption of male supremacy in political affairs. Wu also began to associate herself with Buddhist concepts of universal compassion and wisdom, presenting her rule as a manifestation of enlightened governance that transcended traditional gender limitations. She commissioned the construction of Buddhist temples and monuments that depicted her as a bodhisattva, an enlightened being whose authority derived from spiritual rather than merely political sources. These ideological innovations were accompanied by practical measures designed to consolidate Wu's control over the mechanisms of imperial administration. She continued to expand her intelligence network, eliminate potential rivals, and reward supporters with positions and privileges that bound them to her continued success. Her appointments to key governmental positions increasingly reflected personal loyalty rather than traditional qualifications or family connections. Wu's systematic approach to power consolidation during this period revealed the remarkable scope of her ambitions and the sophisticated methods she employed to achieve them. She understood that claiming imperial authority as a woman required not just the elimination of immediate obstacles, but the fundamental transformation of how political legitimacy was understood and accepted within Chinese civilization. The culmination of Wu's decades-long campaign for absolute power came in 690 when she took the unprecedented step of formally declaring herself emperor of a new dynasty, the Zhou, named after the ancient Chinese dynasty that had ruled over a millennium earlier. This declaration represented not just a personal triumph, but a fundamental challenge to the entire structure of Chinese political and social organization. Wu's assumption of the imperial title was carefully orchestrated to appear as the inevitable result of popular demand and divine mandate rather than personal ambition. She arranged for petitions to be submitted by officials and common people alike, requesting that she accept the burden of imperial rule for the good of the empire. These petitions, while obviously coordinated by Wu's supporters, provided a veneer of legitimacy for what was essentially a revolutionary transformation of Chinese governance. The new emperor Wu Zetian, as she now styled herself, implemented a reign of terror designed to eliminate any remaining opposition to her unprecedented rule. Her methods during this period revealed the full extent of her willingness to employ violence and intimidation to maintain power. She established a secret police force that operated outside traditional legal constraints, authorized the use of torture and execution against suspected enemies, and created an atmosphere of fear that discouraged any organized resistance to her authority. Wu's reign as emperor was characterized by the systematic elimination of potential threats through a combination of execution, exile, and forced suicide. Thousands of officials, nobles, and military officers who were suspected of disloyalty or who represented potential focal points for opposition were removed from their positions and often from life itself. The imperial court became a place where survival depended on absolute submission to Wu's will and where the slightest sign of independence could result in death. Yet despite the brutality of her methods, Wu's reign also demonstrated remarkable administrative competence and strategic vision. She implemented policies that strengthened the empire's military capabilities, expanded its territorial control, and enhanced its economic prosperity. Her appointments to key governmental positions, while based primarily on loyalty, often proved to be highly effective in advancing imperial interests and maintaining domestic stability. Wu's success as an administrator and military strategist helped to justify her unprecedented assumption of imperial authority and provided evidence that female rule could be not just acceptable, but beneficial for the empire. Her reign saw significant territorial expansion, successful military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms, and domestic policies that promoted economic growth and social stability. The intelligence network that Wu had developed over decades of political maneuvering reached its full potential during her imperial reign. Her agents provided her with detailed information about potential threats, allowed her to anticipate and counter opposition before it could organize, and created an atmosphere of surveillance that discouraged dissent and rebellion. This system of control was more comprehensive and effective than any previous Chinese ruler had achieved. Wu's use of psychological warfare and propaganda during her reign revealed her sophisticated understanding of how political authority could be maintained through the manipulation of public perception and the creation of powerful symbolic narratives. She commissioned artwork, literature, and architectural projects that depicted her rule as divinely sanctioned and historically inevitable, while simultaneously spreading stories about the terrible fates that awaited those who opposed her authority. The emperor's court ceremonies and public appearances were carefully choreographed to emphasize her power and legitimacy while intimidating potential opponents. She appeared in elaborate costumes that combined traditional imperial symbolism with innovations designed to emphasize her unique status as China's only female emperor. These visual displays of power were accompanied by rituals that reinforced the message that Wu's authority was absolute and that resistance was both futile and dangerous. Throughout her reign, Wu continued to eliminate potential rivals and threats with the same systematic approach that had characterized her rise to power. She ordered the execution or exile of thousands of individuals who were suspected of disloyalty, including many members of the imperial family who might have served as alternative focal points for legitimacy. Her methods were so thorough and her intelligence network so comprehensive that organized opposition to her rule became virtually impossible. Wu Zetian's reign as China's only female emperor lasted for 15 years, from 690 to 705, a period that demonstrated both the possibilities and the costs of absolute power exercised without traditional constraints. Her rule was marked by territorial expansion, economic prosperity, and administrative efficiency, but also by unprecedented levels of political violence and social control that transformed Chinese governance in ways that would influence the empire for centuries to come. The story of Wu Zetian's rise from concubine to emperor represents one of the most remarkable examples of political ambition and strategic thinking in human history. Her success in achieving and maintaining absolute power in a civilization that had never before accepted female rule required not just ruthless elimination of opponents, but the fundamental transformation of how political legitimacy was understood and accepted within Chinese society. Wu's legacy extends far beyond her personal achievements to encompass the broader questions about power, gender, and political authority that her reign raised and that continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about leadership and governance. Her story demonstrates both the potential for individual determination to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and the terrible costs that such determination can exact from both the individual and the society they seek to control. The blood-soaked path that Wu Zetian carved from the imperial harem to the dragon throne serves as a testament to the transformative power of intelligence, ambition, and absolute ruthlessness in the pursuit of ultimate authority. Her reign stands as a unique chapter in Chinese history, a period when traditional assumptions about power and gender were challenged and temporarily overturned by the will of a single extraordinary and terrifying woman.